Keanu still remembered the weight of that paper in his hands, the way the ink looked too perfect, too calm, for something that felt so wrong. He read the words twice before they started to blur, not because he didn't understand them, but because some part of him refused to accept what they really meant. The letter had arrived that afternoon at a quiet restaurant in downtown Los Angeles, slipped across the table by a nervous waiter who didn't make eye contact. Keanu had come alone, baseball cap low, hoping for one of those rare anonymous lunches where no one stared and no one asked for a picture. But the envelope ruined that small, fragile piece the second he saw Sandra's name written across it in a precise, old-fashioned cursive. It wasn't sent to him, it was sent to her, yet somehow it had found its way into his hands first, like the universe had decided he needed to be a witness, or a warning. He turned the envelope over. No return address. Just a wax seal with a symbol he recognized from the news, from whispered stories on movie sets, from the way bodyguards lowered their voices when they thought actors weren't listening. A crest linked to a family that didn't appear in credits or magazines, but in police files and confidential briefings, one of the most feared Mafia dynasties in the Western Hemisphere. His first instinct was to laugh at the absurdity. A mob boss writing to Sandra Bullock. It sounded like a bad thriller script. But Keanu's gut, that same quiet compass that had saved his life more than once on motorcycles and empty highways, twisted hard. He broke the seal gently, careful not to tear the paper, as if the neatness of it all might mean something. Inside was a single folded sheet, the kind you'd expect from an old-world gentleman inviting someone to a wedding or a charity ball, not from a man whose name was usually followed by the phrase, "under investigation." The first lines were disturbingly polite, almost charming. The writer praised Sandra's kindness, her performances, her generosity. He mentioned small, private details that only someone who had been watching for a very long time could possibly know. The words crawled over Keanu's skin like cold insects. Then he reached the line that made his chest tighten. "It would be my honor to share a private dinner with you to discuss a matter that may change both our lives forever. I assure you, you will be perfectly safe under my protection." Keanu read that sentence 3 times, but it wasn't the invitation that bothered him. It was the insistence on safety. Real safety never has to be promised that loudly. And beneath the surface of the smooth handwriting, he could feel something else, like a faint pressure behind the words. A man so used to control that even his compliments sounded like threats dressed in silk. He looked up from the letter, suddenly hyper-aware of the people around him, the clinking of glasses, the low hum of conversation. Had someone followed him here? Were they watching his reaction? His eyes drifted unconsciously to the windows, to the street beyond, to the reflection of his own frown in the glass. For a moment he saw himself the way the world did, the stoic hero type, the guy who always rode in to fix things. But right then he didn't feel like a hero at all. He felt like a man who had just opened a door he wasn't sure he was strong enough to walk through. A memory surfaced with quiet force. Sandra laughing on a cold set at 3 in the morning, wrapped in a huge coat, handing her extra coffee to a shivering grip without making a big deal out of it. She had that way about her, kindness with no performance, no need to be seen. Over the years, he'd watched her give people space when they needed it, comfort when they didn't know how to ask, jokes when the air on set got too heavy. He owed her nothing, technically. They were friends who crossed paths between scripts and schedules. But there, with that letter in his hand, all those small moments of her quiet goodness lined up in his mind like a decision already made. His thumb lingered over the closing line, a neat signature from the Mafia boss himself, followed by a sentence that finally crystallized the dread in his chest. "I believe that destiny has brought us together, and it would be unwise for either of us to ignore it." That word, unwise, sat like a stone in his throat. It wasn't an invitation. It was a warning disguised as destiny. And beneath it all was the unspoken truth Keanu could feel but not yet name. If Sandra went to that dinner, she wouldn't just be a guest. She would be leverage. He folded the letter back along its neat creases, hands suddenly unsteady in a way they never were during stunts or gun training scenes. This wasn't choreography. There were no marks on the floor to hit, no rehearsals, no bulletproof stunt glass. It was real power, real danger, reaching into the life of someone he cared about. For the first time in a very long while, he felt the sharp edge of fear, not for himself, but for her. As he slipped the letter back into the envelope, one question cut through the noise in his head. If he told Sandra about this exactly as it was, would she walk away? Or would her own stubborn courage drag her straight toward the very table he already knew they should never let her sit at? Keanu called her the moment he stepped out of the restaurant, the letter pressed flat against his palm like evidence. He didn't even realize how tense his voice sounded until Sandra picked up with her usual warmth and then paused mid-hello as if she'd heard something fragile crackling underneath his words. He asked if he could come by, said it was important, and she went quiet for a second. No questions, no teasing, just a simple, steady, "Yeah, of course. I'll put the kettle on." By the time he reached her place, the sun was melting into the horizon, smearing the sky with orange and bruised purple. He liked her house. Not huge, not showy, filled with photos and lopsided drawings from kids' charities, the kind of space that felt lived in rather than curated. She opened the door in jeans and a soft sweater, hair pulled back, eyes searching his face before he could even step inside. He didn't have to say it. She knew something was wrong. "You look like you just watched the dog die in the third act," she murmured, trying to lighten the moment, but her brow stayed furrowed. They sat at her kitchen table, mugs between them, steam curling up and disappearing like the courage he was trying to hold on to. He set the white envelope gently in front of her. For a heartbeat, she didn't touch it, just stared, recognizing the seriousness in the way he'd placed it there, like it was a weapon. "Who's it from?" she asked quietly. "A man who doesn't hear the word no very often," Keanu replied. His tone made her shoulders tense. She picked up the envelope, her fingers tracing the wax seal, and something in her expression hardened into that familiar mix of curiosity and resolve he'd seen on film sets when a director pushed too far or an extra was treated badly. As she unfolded the letter, he watched her face more than the paper. At first, the usual amusement, the flattered, slightly embarrassed smile of someone reading extravagant praise. Then came the subtle shift, her lips pressed into a line, eyes narrowing as she hit the more personal details. By the time she reached the invitation to a private dinner, her jaw had tightened. When she got to the word destiny, she exhaled sharply, a sound caught between disbelief and irritation. She finished it, set the page down, and for a long moment just stared at the grain of the wooden table, her fingertips resting beside the Mafia boss's signature. "This is real?" she asked finally, lifting her eyes to his. "Not some twisted prank?" Keanu shook his head. "He's real, his family's real, and they don't write letters like this unless they're sure they can make people show up." She leaned back in her chair, rubbed her temples, then laughed once, short and humorless. "So let me get this straight. A very dangerous man I've never met somehow knows where I live, what charities I support, probably what I had for breakfast last Tuesday. And he wants to have dinner. Charming." There was a stubborn glint in her eyes now, the same defiant spark that made her walk into rooms where she wasn't expected and own them anyway. "I'm not a kid, Keanu. I'm not going to let some bully with expensive stationery scare me into hiding under my bed." Her words were calm, but he heard the tremor of anger under them, the way she hated being cornered, hated being used. He understood that. Their whole industry was full of people trying to control them in quieter ways. This was different. He struggled to find the line between protecting her and respecting her strength. "I'm not asking you to hide," he said softly. "I'm asking you to remember that this guy doesn't play by any rules we know. On screen, you show up to the dangerous dinner, you outsmart the mob boss, you roll credits. Real life doesn't cut to credits when the scene is over. People like him hold grudges for generations." She looked at him for a long time, and he could see the conflict tearing across her features. Fear, curiosity, fury, and something else. Responsibility. Not just for herself, but for everyone who might be dragged into whatever this man wanted from her. "What happens if I ignore this?" she asked. It wasn't theatrical. It was the bare human question underneath all of it. Keanu hesitated because he hated speculating, hated planting fear where there might still be a way out. Best case, he lets it go and finds a new obsession. Worst case, he reminds you and the people around you that he's not used to being ignored. Sandra flinched at that, but instead of shrinking, she leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes sharp. "You think that's a reason to go?" He shook his head immediately. "I think it's a reason to be careful, to not walk into his world alone." Silence settled between them, heavy and fragile. In that quiet, Keanu was struck by how small the distance was from this warm, familiar kitchen to whatever dark dining room the Mafia boss had in mind. He watched her, wondering which part of her would speak louder. The woman who had fought her way up from nothing, who refused to be intimidated, or the friend who understood that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse an invitation that feels like fate but smells like a trap. She reached for the letter again, reading it one more time, slower now, as if searching for something she'd missed. When she got to the line about being perfectly safe under my protection, she let out a long breath and looked up, eyes suddenly bright with a decision he couldn't quite read. "You know what the cruel part is?" she said quietly. "All of this sounds like respect, flattering almost, but every sentence is really just him saying, 'I own the night you show up.'" Keanu nodded, relieved she saw it, but before he could speak, she straightened in her chair, that stubborn glint in her gaze sharpening into something fearless and dangerous in its own way. "Then maybe," she said, voice low but steady, "it's time someone reminded him I'm not something he can own." She tapped the invitation with 2 fingers, a small, decisive gesture that made his stomach drop as he realized what her courage was about to cost them both. Sandra spent the night circling the same questions until they bled into each other. She paced her living room long after Keanu left, the letter lying on the coffee table like a quiet dare. Every instinct she had pulled in a different direction. Her fear said, "Stay home." Her anger said, "Show up and prove he can't scare you." And somewhere in the middle, her sense of responsibility whispered, "Whatever you do, other people might pay for it." That last voice hurt the most, because it reminded her of every assistant, every driver, every young fan who'd ever waited outside a set just to tell her how much she meant to them. If this man could get to her, he could get to them. She slept badly and woke early, the gray light of dawn creeping through the curtains as if even the sun wasn't sure it wanted to see what she would decide. She made coffee with automatic motions, hands steady but heart rattling around in her chest. When her phone finally rang, the sound cut through the stillness like a blade. "Keanu." She answered before the second ring, a part of her already relieved. It wasn't that she needed him to fix it. She just needed someone who didn't want anything from her except the truth. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble, his voice rough with the kind of exhaustion that comes from staying up too late with your own thoughts. "If you're even considering going, we can't pretend this is just about you and him." The word "we" slipped out of him naturally, and it hit her harder than she expected. "We, not you, not I, we." There was something steadying in that, something that made the fear in her chest loosen its grip just a little. They met again a few hours later, this time not in the warm safety of her kitchen, but in a quiet corner of a hotel lounge where no one expected to see either of them in daylight. Keanu had already picked a table facing the entrance, habitually scanning every new arrival. It wasn't paranoia. It was a learned discipline, years of being watched teaching him how to watch back. When Sandra sat down, he slid a small folder across to her. It wasn't thick. A few printed pages, some photos, a name she'd never spoken out loud until that moment. "You did research," she said, both impressed and uneasy. "I made a few calls," he corrected. "People who know people who wish they didn't know people like him." There was no smugness in his tone, only a quiet gravity. She opened the folder. The Mafia boss's life unfolded in fragments. A grainy picture leaving a courthouse, an article about a businessman accused of laundering money through legitimate companies, a whispered mention in a European paper about charitable donations made in cash, no strings attached, at least on the surface. The deeper she read, the colder she felt. Keanu pointed to a single line in a report from years ago about a singer who turned down a private performance for the same man. Weeks later, her brother's restaurant burned down under mysterious circumstances. No one could prove anything. No one ever did. "He doesn't just collect art or cars," Keanu said quietly. "He collects people, famous ones especially. Their presence makes him look legitimate. Traceable invitations are rare. When he puts something in writing, he's either incredibly confident or incredibly desperate." Desperate, the word lodged in Sandra's mind and wouldn't leave. It changed the shape of everything. Desperate men were unpredictable, but they were also vulnerable. She closed the folder and looked at him, seeing both the worry in his eyes and the firm line of his jaw. He wasn't going to ask her not to go again. He respected her too much for that. But he wasn't going to pretend he wasn't afraid either. That humility, that willingness to show fear instead of hiding behind some fake toughness, moved her more than any grand speech could have. "You're scared," she said softly. "Yeah," he answered, no hesitation. I'm scared of you underestimating what he's capable of, and I'm scared of what happens if we ignore him and he decides to prove a point. There was a small, fragile pause after the word "we" that neither of them filled. It was already clear, if this became a fight, he was in it with her whether she liked it or not. She leaned back, running a hand through her hair, feeling the weight of all the possibilities. If I go with security, if I go loudly, he'll see that as a challenge, she murmured. If I don't go at all, he might come closer, try something worse to show me I made the wrong choice. Either way, someone gets dragged into his orbit. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her lips together, annoyed with herself for letting the crack show. Keanu didn't look away. He didn't rush to comfort or dismiss her fear. He just let it be there, allowed it to exist between them without shame. After a long moment, he said, "What if you don't go as his guest?" She frowned. "What does that even mean?" He hesitated, then met her eyes. "What if you go on your own terms, not alone, not as some trophy at his table? What if we control as much of this as we can instead of letting him choreograph every move?" The idea hovered between them, incomplete but fierce. It wasn't bravado. It was strategy, born from the uncomfortable truth that refusing to play sometimes still meant you were in the game. She thought of all the times in her life she'd had to walk into rooms that didn't want her. A young actress auditioning for roles everyone said were out of her league. The meetings where she'd had to prove she wasn't just a pretty face, but a producer with a brain. The nights she'd gone home feeling humiliated but had shown up again anyway. Courage, she'd learned, wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to move even while your legs were shaking. "I hate that he's making me choose between bad options," she said finally, voice low. "I hate that my courage could put other people at risk, and I hate that part of me wants to march in there and tell him to his face that I don't belong to him or his twisted fantasies of destiny." She stopped, swallowing hard, the heat of anger burning behind her eyes. "I don't want to become smaller because one man with too much power decided I'm his next project." Keanu studied her, seeing the battle play out inside her, the way her kindness wrestled with her fury, the way her humility refused to let her turn this into a movie scene in her head. This was her life, their lives. "Whatever you decide," he said quietly, "you're not facing him as someone he can buy or scare. You're the woman who stays late to talk to the last fan in line. The one who sends food to the crew when we're shooting until 4 a.m. He'll never understand that kind of strength. That's why he's trying to own it." His words landed somewhere deep, where her doubt had been gnawing. For the first time since she'd read the letter, she felt something other than fear or anger. She felt grounded. Not as a celebrity being hunted, but as a person who knew who she was and what she refused to become. She took a slow breath, then another, as if drawing courage from some hidden well inside herself. "Okay," she said at last, the decision beginning to take shape in her voice and the way her shoulders straightened. "If we're going to answer him, we do it one way, carefully, on my terms, and never alone." She held Keanu's gaze, and in that moment both of them understood that whatever line they were about to cross, there would be no way to go back to the life where dangerous letters belonged only in movie scripts. Before he could ask what "on my terms" meant, her phone buzzed on the table. An unknown number lit up the screen, cutting through their fragile sense of control. Sandra stared at it, pulse quickening, while Keanu's hand inched closer, ready to silence it. The call kept ringing, an insistently cheerful tone that felt almost cruel. With a slow, deliberate motion, she turned the phone so they could both see the screen, and the name that flashed there made the air between them turn sharp and cold. It wasn't a number anymore, it was his name. And this time he wasn't writing, he was calling. Sandra let it ring almost to the end. Her thumb hovered over the decline button, her heartbeat loud in her ears. Then she made a choice that scared both of them. She answered and tapped speaker. The line crackled, then a smooth, older voice slipped through, warm and wrong at the same time. "Ms. Bullock, I'm pleased you received my invitation." No introduction, no need. He assumed she knew him. Sandra's eyes met Keanu's, steady but blazing. "I did," she replied. "You've clearly gone to a lot of trouble," a soft chuckle. "For beauty and talent, trouble is a pleasure. I worry you may have misunderstood my intentions." Keanu could hear it, the subtle push beneath the silk. Sandra didn't flinch. "Your letter mentioned destiny and safety," she said. "People who are truly safe don't need to be told they are." There was a pause, faintly amused. "Sharp, I like that. I only wish to talk face to face. A simple dinner, I insist on nothing else." Sandra swallowed. This was the moment she could either back away or step forward. "If I come," she said slowly, choosing every word, "I don't come alone, and I don't come as a gift at your table. I come as myself with my friend, or I don't come at all." Keanu felt fear spike in his chest. She'd drawn a line to a man who didn't respect them. The silence on the line grew heavy, the kind that made you imagine men looking at each other in dark rooms. Finally, he answered, "You are brave, so is your friend. Very well, Ms. Bullock, bring him. I prefer honest courage to submissive fear. Tomorrow, 8 p.m., the Villa di Mare, my car will collect you. I give you my word, no harm will come to either of you." The words sounded like a promise carved from ice. Before Sandra could respond, he added softly, "Ignoring me would be unfortunate for many people. I trust you understand." The call ended. The room felt smaller. Keanu stared at the silent phone, every muscle tight. "You just walked us into the lion's den," he said quietly. Sandra's voice shook, but her eyes didn't. "No," she whispered. "I made sure we walk in together." The next evening the city glittered, but both of them felt the shine as something brittle and false. Keanu wore a dark suit, clean lines, nothing flashy. Sandra chose a black dress that moved easily, simple but strong, like armor made of fabric. Neither tried to hide who they were, pretending would only feed the lie that they were ashamed or afraid. Still, as the Mafia boss's car pulled up, sleek, expensive, windows tinted too dark, Keanu's hand briefly touched her elbow, a small, grounding gesture. "You can still say no," he murmured. She shook her head. "If I run now, I'll never stop looking over my shoulder. I'm tired of living small." The Villa di Mare sat on a hill, all glass and stone and water. Inside, everything gleamed. Polished floors, chandeliers like frozen rain, men in suits who smiled without warmth. Their phones were taken politely, their bags checked. No weapons, no recording, power enforced in the quietest ways. The boss waited in a private dining room overlooking the city lights, dressed like any successful businessman, silver hair slicked back, expression calm. He kissed the air near Sandra's hand, then nodded respectfully at Keanu. "Mr. Reeves, I'm honored. I am not easily surprised." They sat, the table was covered in candles and crystal, too much gold, too many courses. Yet underneath the decadence was an anxiety Sandra hadn't expected. His eyes flicked to the door, to his men, to the windows. This wasn't just a show of power. It was a fortress built by a man who trusted no one. "You're wondering why you are here?" he said, breaking bread with careful fingers. "Simple. I am tired of being seen as a monster hiding in shadows. People like you change how the world looks at a man." Sandra leaned forward, her fear burning into anger. "So you want a public picture," she said. "A story that says you're a generous friend, not a criminal. You think if we smile next to you, your past disappears." He smiled faintly. "Everyone deserves a chance to be more than their past, even me. I donate to hospitals, I fund scholarships, I give work to thousands. The law calls it laundering. I call it redemption." Keanu studied him, hearing something desperate under the practice stories. This man wanted respect the way other people wanted air. "Redemption isn't bought," Keanu said quietly. "It's earned, usually in silence, without cameras." The boss's gaze sharpened. "And what would you know of that?" Keanu didn't look away. "I know real kindness doesn't need a spotlight, and real courage doesn't come from people being too afraid to say no to you." For the first time, a flash of irritation cracked the boss's smooth mask. "You speak boldly in my house." Sandra's voice came softly but firmly. "We're here, aren't we? We walked into your world when we could have called everyone we know and turned this into a public trial. We came privately, respectfully. You say you want redemption. Prove it by letting us walk out of here free with no strings attached. No destiny. No threats to anyone we care about." The room seemed to hold its breath. The boss studied them, these two people who should have been terrified but instead sat grounded in some quiet, stubborn morality he could neither understand nor fully break. His fingers tapped once on the table, a tiny crack in his control. "If I let you go without cooperation," he said slowly, "I gain nothing." Sandra's eyes shone, but she didn't blink. "You gain the one thing you'll never buy with money or fear," she answered. "A choice you can be proud of, alone in the dark when no one is watching." Her words hung there, naked and disarming. For a heartbeat, Keanu thought she'd pushed too far. Then the boss did something neither of them expected. He laughed. Not mocking, tired, almost human. "You think I care about pride?" he said, shaking his head. "I have survived because I care about leverage, about control." Yet his eyes, for the first time, looked truly old. He gazed out at the city. When I was young, I believed fear was the only language men understood. I built an empire on that belief. Now I am surrounded and still alone. People eat at my table, but none would sit here if I had nothing to offer." Sandra's voice softened. "Then maybe that's the problem." He looked at her, surprised by the compassion still in her tone. "You've spent your life buying presents, not earning connection. Real connection can't be forced. Look around this room. Who here would stay if you lost everything?" The words landed like stones. One of his guards shifted, eyes lowered. The boss followed that tiny movement, saw the truth he'd spent years refusing to face. His power could fill a room. It could not fill the hollow inside him. Keanu leaned in slightly. "You say you want to be seen as more than a monster. Monsters don't let people walk away. Men do." The boss's jaw twitched. He'd built his identity on never appearing weak, never yielding. But what if yielding, here with these two who owed him nothing, was his last chance to be something other than a cautionary tale? Sandra watched him, not as an enemy, but as a man standing on the edge of his own choices. Very slowly he exhaled. "If I let you leave," he said, voice quieter, "you will tell this story, perhaps not with names, but with meaning. People will hear it and think they see me more clearly." Sandra nodded. "They might, but what they see will depend on what you do next." Another long silence. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. Finally, he looked at his men. "No photos," he said. "No more letters, no pressure on their friends, their families. They leave untouched. And no one connected to them is ever approached in my name." One of the guards started to object. The boss cut him off with a look. Then he turned back to Sandra. "This is not mercy," he said. "This is an experiment in being the man you believe I could have been if I had chosen differently long ago." His lips curved in a small, weary smile. "If it destroys me, at least it will be by my own hand for once." Sandra's shoulders sagged with a relief so intense it made her eyes sting. Keanu watched the boss carefully, searching for any sign of a trap, but saw only resignation. The three of them sat in a strange, fragile peace, an actress, an actor, and a mafia kingpin who had just taken his first uncertain step toward humanity by voluntarily giving up a piece of his power. When they finally stood to leave, the boss rose as well. "Ms. Bullock," he said, "you spoke to me tonight as if I were capable of goodness I no longer believe in. You are either dangerously naive or braver than anyone I know." Sandra smiled sadly. "Maybe I'm both, but I know one thing: you are capable of this choice. That matters." She extended her hand, not out of friendship, but out of respect for the moment. He hesitated, then shook it, as if touching a life he could never fully join. Outside, the night air felt different, sharper, realer. As the car drove them away from the villa, the city lights no longer looked like glittering lies, but like small, stubborn stars. Sandra leaned her head back, finally letting a tear fall. "I was so scared," she whispered. "Me too," Keanu answered. "But you didn't let fear make you cruel. You walked into his world and stayed yourself. That's rare." She turned to him. "We could have called in favors, made a mess, turned this into war." He nodded. "Instead, you chose to give a dangerous man one honest chance to be better, and you told him the truth to his face. That's a different kind of power." For a moment, they sat in quiet, the weight of what almost happened pressing against the fragile safety of what actually did. Weeks later, rumors would circle, whispers of a crime lord suddenly withdrawing from certain businesses, quietly funneling more money into real charities with no headlines attached. Some said he was ill. Others said he'd grown cautious. Only 3 people knew that one night at a table high above the city, he'd been confronted not with guns or threats, but with something far more disarming. 2 people who met his power with humility, courage, and inconvenient kindness. Sandra and Keanu never spoke his name in public. When interviewers asked about the scariest dinner you've ever had, they'd share a quick private glance and answer with a joke. But in quieter moments when life felt heavy, they would each remember that night and draw strength from it. The reminder that real bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's walking into the darkness and refusing to give up your light. And somewhere behind guarded walls, an aging boss sat alone at his table, looking out over the same city, wondering, for the first time in decades, if it wasn't too late for a man like him to start choosing in small, private ways the kind of goodness no one would ever applaud him for.